am going to cover something that can be a little bit complicated, which is citational practices. This is one of those topics that I feel like nobody ever really teaches, or they don't really talk about the impact that it can have on your writing, and that a lot of our baggage around who to cite and when to cite comes from the sort of training that we get as undergraduates, and also what we do in terms of grading and teaching in that way as well. So I know that for me, a lot of the anxiety around citational practices comes from a fear of plagiarizing, which was really drilled into me as an undergrad. You know, don't plagiarize, make sure you quote. But as we move into sort of the more advanced ways of writing academically, there's a lot more nuance. It's not just take an idea, quote it, put the citation and the page number in. There's reasons why you may or may not want to cite in specific ways. So there are two types of citations that I'm going to talk about today. One is direct quotations, which are what almost all of us are most familiar with, which is you take somebody else's words, you put a quotation mark around the beginning, you put a quotation mark around the end, and that is the way that you are citing somebody else's words. These can be brief. You know, I've cited one word, like a term. Sometimes you might have a quotation that goes on for pages. But a direct quotation is anytime you're taking somebody's words and sort of directly moving them into your document. The second type of citation, which is the one that most of us have less familiarity with, is the kind of category of paraphrasing and summarizing, where you say something along the lines of, you know, as discussed in this piece, you summarize it and then you move on. And so you're not directly quoting somebody else's words, but you are relying on their ideas, and that's why you're citing them. So these are the two sort of schools of thought. I often find that we think and sort of more closely around category number one, but category number two is actually really useful in lots of types of the academic writing that all of us are being asked to do. So when you use a direct quote, this gives more power, like rhetorical power, to the primary source. So say you are using a term that somebody else invented and you're quoting that term directly. That gives a lot of power because you're saying, I'm using this idea, this term, this word from somebody else. Another time that you're going to want to kind of use a direct quotation is when the language and the phrasing are important. So if you are working with the idea of somebody else and the way that they described it, the phrases that they used, the language is significant, anytime you're sort of ticking any of those boxes, you're going to want to use a direct quote, because it's not just the ideas that are useful, but the way they said them, how they phrased them, those are all essential to the kind of argument that you're making. One of the kind of main considerations for these kind of quotations, these direct quotations, is how long you're going to quote. I know that for me, I have a tendency in the early drafts of my writing to put big chunky quotations, you know, 2 paragraphs sometimes, but the length of the quote is often really essential. The more you're directly quoting from other people's ideas, the less power, sort of rhetorical power, your argument has. So if you've ever gotten the feedback like, I'm losing your voice here, or I wish that your voice was stronger, or it's a little bit hard to follow your argument, one of the first places that I look if I'm getting that sort of feedback, or if I'm working with somebody who has that feedback, is to think about how long are the quotes that you're using. So if you go through and you highlight, here are everybody else's words in green, and here are my words in blue, and it's green, 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 a little bit of blue, green, 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 then it's probably really useful to go ahead and think about how long are these quotations, and am I using direct quotes when it's the most significant that I'm paying attention to their language and phrasing. So the kind of like buzzword that you can think about for when you're going to use a direct quotation is when you're using someone's idea. I'm taking their idea and I'm using it to draw a connection to my idea, or I'm using their idea to examine this example. If you're using the idea, then it makes sense that you're going to kind of directly quote it. This is in contrast to when you might think about paragraphs, paraphrasing and summarizing. So a paraphrase is, say, somebody that you're quoting, or somebody that you're referencing inside of your work, takes 3 pages to summarize this, or to kind of work through this case study. You might paraphrase their argument in 2 or 3 lines and then say, as they say, but it's all in your own words. You might summarize 2 or 3 pages of a case study into a paragraph. When you're using a paraphrase and a sort of summarize of other people's ideas, it gives more rhetorical power to your argument because you are not giving space to their exact words. You're summarizing them for the reader. You're speaking on behalf of them. So in the same way that if you speak on behalf of somebody, you're more visible, you're easier to nail down. It's the same idea here. This can be really helpful if you need to quickly move through background. I know that many people, when they start to write their literature reviews, they start with direct quotations, but a lot of times it's easier to start with paraphrasing and summarizing and then add in specific quotes if the language or the phrasing is significant. Many times you can often put more detail in the foot or the end note. So say you have a paragraph where you're kind of summarizing the main 6 books in the field and you don't need any significant level of detail. You might put more detail inside of the foot or the end note where you say, it's not relevant in the sort of like flow of this paragraph overall for me to tell you that I think this person is wrong and that their whole methodology is flawed, but you might include that in the footnote or the end note. You might say, for more on this specific detail, please see the next sets of these chapters because they go into more detail in the case study. If you are a person who tends to put a lot of detail inside of the foot or the end note, it can be also really useful to see if you're actually making arguments in there that need to move up into the text. I know that when I first started writing with foot and end notes, I went bananas with them. I put all sorts of like my interesting original thoughts inside of those end notes. And it took a friend in my writing group saying, hey, like you're making really good points here. How about you move them out of the footnote and into the main body of the text. So footnotes and endnotes can go both ways. Sometimes they're really useful to sort of save you space inside of the actual text itself. Sometimes it feels like a braver space and you might want to move that in. But in general, the kind of like watchword for when you might want to use this mode is if you're mentioning the ideas of other people in order to move more quickly into your own ideas. So if a direct quotation is when you're using an idea, I'm taking this and I'm using it actively. This is more, I'm mentioning it. It's relevant, but I'm mentioning it so that I can move more quickly onto my own. So I'm going to give you some examples of how this works in practice, or the ways that the wrapping that you put around quotations can help to sort of strengthen your voice. So these are 3 versions of the same sort of idea in a sentence. These come from a book called The Elements of Academic Style that I will link to in the show notes. I think it's a really useful book. It's theoretically geared towards the humanities, but I think there's a lot of really useful things in 80% of it is relevant to everybody, I would say. So in terms of the examples of balance, this first sentence is the strongest in terms of the author's voice. And it reads, but its power lies in James's capacity to re-energize an obsolete trope on behalf of literalizing the common sense that tells us that, quote, an attack on architecture is an attack on man. So we're using the specific phrase there, an attack on architecture is an attack on man. It's, it's snappy, it's cool, but the majority of the sentence is the person's argument, where they're saying that James, the power of this argument lies in this capacity to energize the trope. The second sort of middle of the road here is one that you can kind of read on your own, but listen to how different that same idea sounds when you put all of this detail in. So the third example, but its power lies in James's capacity to re-energize an obsolete trope on behalf of literalizing the common sense that tells us, as George Bataille wrote in a short essay on architecture published in his Critical Dictionary, an attack on architecture is an attack on man. So in this first sentence, we don't know who said this. We only know that this is a witty phrase. In the second version, we tell you that George Bataille put it. And on this third section, we're telling you where he said it, what the context of. It was a short essay. But if you look at kind of the difference between this one and even this one, there's a big chunk in the middle that really separates the context of the quote from the quote itself. So this might be something that you play with. Where do you fall on this particular spectrum? In this sentence, we're putting James's capacity in specific argument and conversation with this quote. In this, it's hard to tell where that idea came from at all. But in this third example, it's really difficult to make that connection because there's a big chunk of something right in the middle of that sentence. So this is a recipe that you can use for direct quotations that I think for me has been really helpful in kind of explaining how not to lose your voice when you're directly quoting from somebody else. So the recipe is that you're going to want to introduce the quote, why you're using it, what the significance is. You're going to then quote, and then you're going to resolve or link it back to your argument. So if you've ever graded sort of a freshman composition essay, a lot of times they might do this introduction, but they quote and they say, as this person says, this, as this person says, this. And they're really missing this sort of third piece, which is this person says, this quote, here's how it's relevant, or here's what it means, or here's how it links to my argument. An easy way to remember that recipe is to think about the quote sandwich. So if the meat of your quotes, the sort of juicy bits are there, it's not going to be as satisfying for the reader if it's just a bunch of lunch meat on the plate. It will make a more robust snack or meal if you wrap it up and you say, this is why I'm telling you this, here's what I'm telling you, and this is why it's relevant. It's more satisfying, and also you're giving a lot more heft instead of just saying quote, 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 which is often what earlier drafts can feel like. So when you're kind of dealing with heavily citational pieces like the literature review section, it can be really easy to turn those sections into just a sort of stacking up of quotations where you're not really explaining why you're citing these people, why they're in the order that they're written. So thinking about roadmap and not your exams can be a really useful kind of paradigm shift. So many PhD programs have, in the sort of like earlier stages of the program, a gate that you have to pass where you take some sort of exams. They could be oral, they could be written, they could be all sorts of different versions. But in those exams, pedagogically, the goal is for you to prove that you've read enough in order to conduct your own research. And then nobody says to you in the literature review, you're not doing that again. You've already proven that you know enough in order to embark on your research. So instead, these kind of heavily citational places like literature reviews, it can be easier to think about them as a roadmap. I'm showing you who I'm closest to and who I'm furthest away. So the question is not, did I prove that I'm read enough in order to make this argument. And instead, it's what do people need to know in order to understand my thinking? Who am I closest to and who am I furthest away? So if you're giving people directions through, say, the history of a methodology, or you're giving somebody directions through the history of your field or the history of a term, the closer you are to the people that you're most directly engaging with, the more detail you're going to need. And in the same way that if you're giving somebody directions from, say, one side of your country to another, there might be big pieces of it where you don't need a lot of detail. Like if I'm giving you directions to, drive through from where I live now to where my parents live, I'm going to say, follow the turnpike for 4 hours through Ohio. And it's not that there is no detail in Ohio. There are, there's turns, there's rest stops, there's my favorite Panera, place to eat, but that detail is not relevant to you, because where you really need the detail is the tricky turns getting out of my neighborhood, which of these exits to take, where the construction is around significant turns. And then the closer that you get to the final sort of destination, my house, the more detail you're going to need. So thinking about that can really help you give more shape to when you can paraphrase and when you might want to directionally quote. If you're just trying to say, for 60 years we did this, then you don't need to tell them everything that people did for 60 years. It's just drive through Ohio, right? So the roadmap metaphor can really help you see where the detail is going to help you and where it's going to kind of trip you up. Because the more, if you approach the same level of detail for kind of every mile that a reader is traveling through the background of your field or the history of that methodology, you're going to give them, 60 pages of direction when stay on the turnpike for 200 miles is going to work just as well. So these are two ways that you can kind of experiment through working with the literature. These are two activities that you can try. I like both of them. But the first one is that if you're really struggling with a heavily citational piece of work, like a literature review or, that section in a chapter, I challenge you to try it without citing anybody directly at all. So instead of sort of sitting in your desk with 800 PDFs open or all of your books open and you're sort of flipping and you read a little bit and then you quote a little bit and then you maybe write a little bit, it can be really difficult, but very enlightening to try that without any literature at all, without any direct quotations at all. So this forces you to paraphrase, it forces you to summarize, and it forces you to kind of say, okay, can I trust that the most important pieces of literature for my argument are the ones that I'm going to know the best, and they're the ones that I can feel the most confident about paraphrasing. So most of us have, 5, 10, the number really depends depending on sort of your field and the specific project. But most of us know this project was born out of an engagement with this particular article. I know it the best. I might not be able to directly quote it from memory, but I can tell you why I didn't like it or why the method was so revolutionary to me. And so if you try to challenge yourself just for a POM to write without any quotations, you might find that it's much easier to sort of draft all the paraphrasing and summarizing and really keep your voice front and center and then plug in quotations as you need, as opposed to writing from a big list of quotations and then almost having to kind of rewrite it in order to put your voice back in there. So I really recommend this, especially if you're getting a lot of feedback that's like, I'm losing your voice, or it's hard to follow your argument here. Trying it without the quotations can be a good way to sort of address that. The other activity that can be really fun, especially if you are a spatial thinker or you're kind of really trying to come to grips with various structures for a more literature heavy section, is to actually think about how you would map it out spatially. So I'm a pretty spatial thinker. I like to I like to touch things. I like to move things along. It can be really hard for me to define what structures I might want to use during specific, if I'm in a lit review section, I'm like, okay, do I want to do this thematically or chronologically? I'm not really sure. It can help me to not do that at my desk and instead, put all of the names of the different themes on Post-it notes and shuffle them around on my wall. Very famously, I once took all of the books that I needed for a specific literature review section, and I put them all into a bunch of shopping bags, and I went to a coffee shop, back when we could all go to coffee shops, and I stacked and restacked books for 2 or 3 hours. And did that cause the baristas to be alarmed on my behalf? Absolutely. And did they ask my friends to stop doing that because it was scaring the other customers? Sure. But it was really helpful for me, instead of like trying to outline 4 different structures, to just play with the books and say, okay, if I group all of these people in methodology, there's 80 things here, and there's only 2 things in this paragraph. So maybe I need to sort of separate this out more detailed. If I put them in chronological order, actually, it's really hard to see where the sort of theory developed, because there's this big gap in the middle. So you might want to draw a map. Who are you closest to? Who are you furthest away from? Where did everybody in your field start? And then where did they separate? Did some people cluster over here and other people clustered over there? Thinking about it spatially can really help you see where you're closest to, and then sort of where you need to be detailed in that map and where you don't.